Welcome to our module lecture on foreign policy. In 2009, federal police officers take a suspect into custody after a shooting in Tijuana, Mexico, which is located just south of the border with the United States. Tijuana is one of the major battlegrounds of cartels in the ongoing drug war, which has taken the lives of thousands in the last several years. The United States gives money to Mexico to help them fight the cartels and prevent drugs from coming over the border. However, people in the United States who are willing to buy the drugs are continuing to fuel the drug wars that are lowering Mexicans' quality of life. This chapter briefly examines the history of American foreign policy and the roles of Congress, interest groups, and the bureaucracy in shaping and supporting it. We also look at foreign policy changes that the United States currently faces and is likely to face in the years ahead. Outside of the War of 1812, most of the 19th century American foreign policy was based on establishing trade relations with other countries. The United States was largely isolationist in its outlook, minimizing its role in world affairs. That changed with the Spanish-American War at the close of the century. It marked America's entry onto the world stage as a major power and began America's slow movement towards internationalism, actively intervening in global matters. The exception to U.S. isolationism was the Monroe Doctrine, an assertion of the U.S. sphere of influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine not only discouraged European interests in Central and South America, but also left the U.S. free to act in and against countries such as Mexico, Cuba, Panama, when American interests were at stake. America had developed as an industrial power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The U.S. had been exporting to England, France, and their allies during the early years of World War I. It had ideological ties to the democracies within the alliance. The U.S. remained neutral, but when German submarine attacks on neutral shipping challenged America's freedom of the seas, the U.S. declared war on Germany and her allies in April 1917. Following the war, President Woodrow Wilson attempted to forge new roles for the U.S. and the rest of the world. He set out 14 points based on the principles of democracy, self-determination, and the rule of law. His goal was to establish a League of Nations. However, American political and public opposition to further U.S. foreign involvements returned American policy to isolationism. The Great Depression dramatically affected economies worldwide. It also worsened political and social conditions in Europe throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, leading to the rise of the fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Spain. At the same time, the growth of Japanese industrial and military power threatened interests in China and the Far East. World War II began in the late 1930s, and the U.S. maintained a tenuous neutrality. It eventually agreed to supply war materials to the Allies through the Land-Lease Act of 1940. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent declaration of war by Germany in December 1941 ultimately brought the U.S. into World War II. This is a picture of the Japanese bombing of the U.S. Naval Fleet Station in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This event launched the United States headlong into the most catastrophic war of the 20th century. The victory in World War II left the United States as a global superpower. U.S. military and economic strength oversaw the rebuilding of the world's political and financial structures. America's sole rival, both militarily and ideologically, was the Soviet Union, which used its post-war position to dominate most of Eastern Europe. America's response to the threat of Soviet power in Europe was the Marshall Plan, a massive reconstruction effort that discouraged the spread of communism throughout Western Europe. The Cold War with the Soviet Union became the focus of U.S. foreign policy from the 1940s until the early 1990s. It was characterized by diplomatic and economic hostility and by a number of proxy wars and actions, almost all of which took place outside of Europe. The Korean War of the early 1950s and the Vietnam War were the largest and bloodiest of these. At the same time, the U.S. supported anti-communist actions throughout the world, especially in South America, and sponsored coups in several countries. The Vietnam War changed the shape of American foreign policy. The lack of a clear-cut military victory and the emergence of China as a superpower following the Sino-Soviet split changed the nature of the Cold War struggle. At the height of the Cold War, the United States found itself in a thankless struggle with a combination of South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters and the Communist Army of North Vietnam. The nation had entered the war to stop the spread of communism, but by the time the last Americans left, North and South Vietnam were united as one communist nation. The early 1970s saw a period of reduced tensions known as détente dominate U.S. foreign policy. This short-lived period ended abruptly, however, with the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan in 1979. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 brought a more aggressive U.S. foreign policy. Reagan sent hard-line signals to the Soviet Union, and the United States military underwent an unprecedented arms buildup through the early and middle 1980s. The faltering Soviet economy couldn't keep pace with the cracks within the communist system began to develop by the end of the decade. Popular movements throughout Eastern European countries were successful in ending decades of communist rule. American foreign policy during the 1990s was a combination of several strategies, among them forms of isolationism, selective engagement, cooperative security, and American primacy. The 1991 Persian Gulf War, instigated by the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, illustrates how this combination worked. In response to the invasion, the U.S., under President George H.W. Bush, was able to assemble a coalition of nations, most importantly including Russia, under the auspices of the UN to confront Iraq's aggression. The U.S.-led UN forces were successful in driving the Iraqi military from Kuwait. The 9/11 attacks drastically realigned U.S. foreign policy priorities. In direct response to these attacks, the Bush Doctrine focused attention on terrorist groups. The doctrine discarded the principle of collective security and maintained America's right to attack perceived threats. This doctrine was publicly supported in the following war in Afghanistan, but created controversy when the U.S. invaded Iraq, believing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. After decades of power, the communist government of the Soviet Union and those of the Eastern European nations suddenly collapsed. Can you answer this question? Ronald Reagan committed to a massive arms buildup that the USSR couldn't match. The arms race devastated the Soviet economy, and the USSR crumbled at the end of the 1980s. The National Security Council, or NSC, was formed in 1947 in a post-World War II reassessment of American defense and intelligence needs. The NSC gathers security-related information for the President from military services and other executive departments and agencies. By law, the NSC must include the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, the Secretaries of State and Defense, and the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although most presidents have included other individuals as well. The NSC's range of power has varied over time, and although it remains in its capacity as the foremost advisory body to the president in terms of foreign policy. Its political decision-making power has diminished considerably. Our current Secretary of State is Rex Tillerson. The primary responsibility for U.S. diplomacy is held by the Department of State. This department was among the first executive departments created under the Washington administration. The State Department oversees all U.S. embassies, diplomats, and foreign aid programs. Its core mission is to represent the United States abroad and in various international organizations. It provides information and analysis and advises on the possible consequences of implementing various aspects of foreign policy, including economic agreements, formal treaties, and foreign aid. The State Department has approximately 30,000 employees headed by the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary and undersecretaries in charge of planning and coordination. Individual bureaus in the State Department are divided by region and by issue. All over the world, 3,500 foreign service officers, many of whom are career diplomats, serve in embassies, consulates, and bureaus. The United States posts foreign service officers to virtually every nation around the globe. The Department of Defense has its origins in the Department of War, one of the original executive departments. Defending the nation from external attack is its main responsibility. Since the end of the Cold War, however, the department's role has expanded into other foreign policy objectives, such as counterterrorism efforts, training foreign militaries, and peacekeeping. U.S. military expenditures dwarf those of the rest of the world and have been trending upward, most significantly since the period beginning in 2001. The size and cost, as well as the extended roles of the Department of Defense, have generated considerable debate at a time when many analysts note the change of adversaries from the former Soviet Union to non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda. The Department of Defense is the largest executive branch agency, which as of 2008 employed more than 34% of all federal government workers. This is our current Department of Defense Secretary, General James Mattis. He's also referred to as General Bulldog Mattis. Created at the beginning of the Cold War to gather foreign intelligence, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, has often played an active role in executing foreign policy. Early CIA activities included influencing election outcomes, sponsoring coups, and assassinating foreign leaders. Generally, however, the CIA remains true to its mandate and collects and analyzes intelligence information for the president. Although subject to stricter oversight than previously, the CIA has a fair amount of independence in carrying out these functions. The CIA's role is difficult and sometimes controversial. As the most visible intelligence agency, it often receives blame for perceived failures within this area. In addition to the CIA, there are a host of other intelligence gathering bodies in each branch of the armed forces, the State Department, and the Department of Defense. The National Security Agency, or the NSA, specializes in cryptography and monitors communications coming into and out of the United States. The newest cabinet-level organization is the Department of Homeland Security, which coordinates the efforts of various agencies in preventing and responding to the attacks in the United States. Which of the following has the largest budget? In 2010, the United States accounted for 43% of the world's total military expenditures. America now spends more on its military than the next 14 nations combined. Because all spending-related legislation originates in the House of Representatives, Congress can legislate upon a wide variety of foreign issues. Congress can cut or increase spending for foreign aid or defense programs, and when it comes to the U.S. economy, Congress does have to pay much attention to trade. Tariffs, which are taxes on goods exchanged between nations, are the primary issue within trade policy. High tariffs tend to discourage trade, whereas lower tariffs tend to promote trade. The most significant trade agreement in recent history is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, signed by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. With the reduction of tariff barriers and the rise of globalization, numerous U.S. manufacturing plants have relocated abroad. Here, auto workers rally to keep a domestic Chrysler assembly plant open. How should policymakers weigh the relative costs and benefits of free trade? Although the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, under the Constitution only Congress can declare war. However, in overseeing armed conflict, Congress and the President often share power. In military policy, the President has greater resources and can operate more quickly and more unilaterally than Congress. However, Congress retains some nominal control over the deployment of forces. The 1973 War Powers Act passed over President Nixon's veto in response to what was perceived as a failure in Vietnam, restricted presidential action by legally requiring the president to consult with Congress before committing armed forces into hostile situations, to report to Congress within 48 hours after troops are introduced into an area where hostilities exist or are imminent, to withdraw troops within 60 days unless Congress authorizes them to stay longer. Ultimately, though, the act has never been practically applied and has never been used to end a military operation. Although nominated by the President, cabinet appointments and other high-profile foreign affairs positions must be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. The Senate Committee on Foreign Relations governs the confirmation hearings. These confirmations are often partisan affairs. A nominee who holds different views, and policy positions than members of a committee is likely to have the confirmation stalled, blocked, or rejected. As mentioned before, the Constitution grants the Senate the power to ratify treaties. On several occasions, however, the Senate has chosen not to do so, most notably the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I. More recently, in 1999, the Senate rejected the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty after Republican objections. Instead of making treaties that must be approved by Congress, presidents often go the route of signing executive agreements. Like treaties, these agreements are binding. The number of these agreements far surpasses the number of treaties, and this ratio has increased significantly in recent history. Congress, though, ultimately controls the funding for the implementation of executive agreements and therefore retains considerable influence on their effect. Congress plays many roles in foreign policy. Can you identify any of them from this selection? America's unique position in the realm of geopolitics compels it to confront a number of foreign policy changes. Among the most formidable today include North Korea's nuclear program, the ongoing Middle East situation, and the rise of China as a global superpower. U.S. nuclear strategy has relied on the policy of deterrence. During the Cold War, the theory behind mutually assured destruction helped avoid direct conflict between the superpowers. Many nations sought to reduce nuclear weapons in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, since the end of the Cold War, concerns about nuclear proliferation have escalated. In the 1990s, North Korea appeared capable of building nuclear weapons. Tensions increased when George W. Bush denounced North Korea's nuclear activity immediately following the 9/11 attacks. From 2004 until Kim Jong-il's death in 2011, North Korea has tested nuclear weapons and developed ballistic missile technology. However, North Korea has been faced with increasing poverty, international isolation, and a poor economy. The U.S. has used economic assistance and sanctions as an effective carrot and stick against North Korean intentions. The new regime in North Korea has announced that it will suspend all nuclear weapons testing in exchange for substantial food aid from the United States. U.S. intervention in Middle Eastern politics began in earnest following World War II. Oil was considered essential to U.S. interests, and American and the UN assumed the roles previously played by Britain and France in mediating political conflicts in the area. In particular, U.S. support for the State of Israel beginning in 1948 led to increasing involvement in the region. As the United States continued to maintain a strong presence in the region, its strategic interests became more complex, even in the light of taking American diplomats as hostages in Iran in 1979. By the time of the 9/11 attacks, America's economic and security interests in the Middle East were inseparable. America had long supported regimes, such as the one in Saudi Arabia, that oppressed their people. Following 9/11, the American military has increased its reliance on these regimes to fight terrorism. But at the same time, the leaders in the U.S. publicly supported the democratic rights of these oppressed peoples. When tensions in these countries erupted, a combination of popular demonstration coordinated through social media, such as Twitter and Facebook, and military action brought down governments in Tunisia, in Libya, as well as in Egypt. This was collectively known as the Arab Spring. From a foreign policy standpoint, the Arab Spring movement caused the U.S. to move faster than it ordinarily would have. The fast movement led to quick reevaluations of situations on the ground and reassessment of long-term policy for the area. What would eventually be known as the Arab Spring began with protests in Tunisia in early 2011. This upheaval placed the Obama administration in a very difficult position. The U.S. did not want to alienate an ally, but on the other hand, it didn't want to support a regime that might fail and be replaced by one that was hostile to U.S. interests. Chinese-American relationships have been cyclical in nature since their beginnings in 1784. Under this scenario, the U.S. encourages an open-door policy with China. When China responds with openness, the U.S. sees this as a threat to American interests and scales back its eagerness for Chinese growth. In the early 20th century, Japan emerged as America's biggest economic and military rival in the Pacific. Accordingly, the U.S. gave substantial aid to China. But after 1941, China and the U.S. became allies in the war against Japan. Following World War II, mainland China turned to communism. It closely aligned with the Soviet Union, became adversarial to the United States. A thaw in relations occurred when President Nixon visited China in 1972. The late 20th century again saw Americans attempt to open China to greater access to trade. Changes in the Chinese leadership resulted in the loosening of many of its financial restrictions over the flow of capital. From 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, its economy has boomed. China has quickly become the world's second largest economy. This has serious implications for the U.S. economy. China has undervalued its currency, making its good affordable on the global market. China has invested more and more money into the U.S., making it a large holder of American debt. Other concerns are the piracy and counterfeiting of American intellectual property and ideological differences, especially those concerning human rights violations. Over the last decade, growth rates in China have ranged between 6 and 11%. Construction has been a primary driver of much of this growth, and here we see an aerial view of the Expo Village in Shanghai, where China hosted the 2010 World Expo. So, given all this information and what you studied in your textbook chapter, how has the U.S. foreign policy changed with circumstances? How do you see the role of the U.S. in the world today?